Books and Books and the Cuban Research Institute, which co-sponsors tonight's event, which is the virtual book presentation of Caribeños at the Table, How Migration, Health, and Race Intersect in New York City by Melissa Fuster. My name is Jorge Duani. I'm the director of the Cuban Research Institute, and we're happy to co-sponsor tonight's event. We're very proud to present the most recent work by leading scholars and writers on the Cuban and Cuban American experience, and we hope that we can soon schedule in-person public events at Books and Books in Coral Gables. Let me remind you that you can submit questions during and after the author's talk by using the Ask a Question button at the bottom of your screen, and I'll compile these questions and pose them to the author after our conversation. Also, just to remind you, you can buy the book online. There's another button there that says Buy Caribeños at the Table, or you can also reserve the book to pick it up at the Books and Books library. So I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's guest author, my colleague and friend, Melissa Fuster. Melissa Fuster is currently Associate Professor of Public Health, Nutrition at Tulane University. Before joining Tulane, just recently, she was an Assistant Professor of Public Health and Nutrition at Brooklyn College of the City University of New York. She completed her PhD and MS in Food Policy and Applied Nutrition at Tufts University, and a postdoctoral fellowship in Food Studies at New York University. She also earned her BA in Sociology and Anthropology at Florida International University, my own institution. Dr. Fuster's research examines the structural and cultural factors that influence food practices and the policies implemented to improve them. Her work analyzes the underlying determinants of diet-related health inequities, focusing on Latin American communities in the United States. The research combines various perspectives on food policy, applied nutrition, public health, anthropology, sociology, and history. She's currently working to engage Latin American restaurants in the United States in designing and implementing innovations to facilitate healthier eating. Her previous work has been published in numerous professional journals such as Food, Culture, and Society, Food and Food Waste, Ecology of Food and Nutrition, Public Health Nutrition, Ethnicity and Disease, the Journal of Immigrant and Minority Health, and the Journal of Racial and Ethnic Health Disparities. Melissa has asked me to engage in conversation with her about the contents of her book, which I've already had a pleasure to read, and I really recommend it. So without further ado, let's bring in the author so we can start the conversation. I think we lost our author in cyberspace for a moment. Hopefully she'll come in any minute now. Here we go. Hello, Melissa.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you and see you well. So let me just begin then by welcoming you to the virtual stage and asking you my first question, which is, why do you focus on the food practices of Puerto Rican, Dominican, and Cuban immigrants in the U.S., particularly in New York City? Why not Miami or Orlando or other cities where you have substantial Latino immigrant populations?
Thank you. And also, before I jump into that great question, I do want to thank you and thank Books and Books for having me and the opportunity to speak about my book. So thank you. And that is, again, a very good question. I will say that at some point in the beginning, when I was thinking of the book, I did wanted to do it all. Like, I had this big dream of looking at our communities in New York City, Miami, and even going down to the Caribbean and seeing all these interactions. However, there is so much you can do, right, in a single book. But I think also the real origin story of the book started when I finished my PhD. I had the opportunity, as you mentioned in the introduction, to do a postdoctoral fellowship at New York University. And having the opportunity to move to New York, where there is such a historic Puerto Rican and also Cuban community and now Dominican community in the city, it turned out to be the perfect chance to do something that I wanted to do before that I wasn't able to do with my PhD, that was focus my work on my community, the Puerto Rican community. And I think also, while I could have maybe more easy written a book of just Puerto Rican foodways in the city, I also wanted to bring in the stories of fellow Caribeños, Cubans, and Dominicans, because I feel that gives it more depth versus focusing on just one community, where sometimes we can err on making things too unique and losing the nuance of the movement, or all the communications and influences that we have as Caribeños.
Great. And that leads me to another question, which I hadn't thought of before, but now that I'm listening to you, it's a question that I have faced myself in my work, which is, what do these groups have in common, Dominicans, Cubans, and Puerto Ricans, as opposed to, say, Mexicans or Central Americans, which would justify focusing on this particular region of the world rather than Latin America as a whole?
Yeah, I think as I was writing my book, I had in mind this beautiful song by Davidita, Son Tres, and it speaks about the sisterhood of our islands. I think growing up in Puerto Rico, it was very clear to see that we are very much connected. So it had to do a lot with that historical geographic connection, common colonial history, and at the same time, even though they're not the same, we have very similar diets. At the same time, what I feel makes this work so interesting, and of course your work as well, is that even though we have so many things in common, the current situations on the islands and also here are so different. And especially when you're studying food and dietary outcomes, in a way, I thought I could control in the analysis all these aspects about the political situation, the different relationships we have with the United States, the different migratory histories, to be better able to talk about the structural factors and how they influence diets beyond just culture.
Right. And I think your original title had something to do with plantains, wasn't it? So I wanted to ask you, why
there
the three cuisines of the Hispanic Caribbean based on plantains and other things like rice and beans and so on?
I mean, I laugh because the book, like I'm sure you know, it had, I don't know how many titles. The one before this one was, I feel, the fun one. It was called Plantains in Motion. And I think at some point somebody said, like, oh, that could be a perfect Broadway show, something like that. But definitely, yeah, there is that. The plantain is something that we have in common, the arroz, habichuela, the rice and beans. Also, it also differs in interesting ways from the continental Latin diet. Like, I think, for example, Mexico, Mesoamerica, you have a lot of corn tortillas, versus in the Caribbean, it's more the vianda, the yuca, and other things like that.
Right. And so this leads me to another question about the ethnic and racial groups that make up Caribbean cultures, Hispanic Caribbean cultures, and food in particular practices. So how do Caribbean cuisines combine indigenous, African, Spanish, US, and other cultural influences?
Yeah, that is
one entire chapter on that whole issue.
Yeah. Yeah, and I even had a longer piece on that. But and I think that there are other people that, of course, historians that have written about this. I lean a lot on the work of Cruz Miguel Ortiz Cuadra and Eating Puerto Rico, where he does a beautiful job looking at how the rice, the beans, the pork, bacalao, all of these things got to our tables. And you have the movement of people. I think that's what makes the Caribbean, not only the Hispanic Caribbean, but all the Caribbean, so delicious and interesting, that it is a melting pot of so many flavors from all over the world. We do, in growing up in Puerto Rico, we grow up thinking, okay, we are Spanish, Taino, and African, but then you also have these other people that came. Like, for example, if you think of Dominican cuisine, they have the kipe, that's Syrian and Lebanese. You have French influence in Cuban cuisine. So it's just this beautiful melting pot. Something happened. I mean, of course, we can go longer on the colonial history. Some of the foods, like the plantain, that were brought in as part of slavery. So even though, yes, we can talk about it in terms of that deliciousness, of course, there is also this difficult history of colonialism, enslavement, and those things that also makes us who we are.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned several times in your book that the American influence is stronger in Puerto Rico, especially through the taste for processed foods like carne beef or corned beef and sausages, which I know you like very much. So can you say a little bit more about that, the American influence?
Yeah. I think, as Puerto Rico has been part of the U.S. For some time, I think we have been served as this open market for U.S. goods. We got fast foods as early as 1950s. So things like burgers, McDonald's are not, we move here with a taste for that in the first place. And with that also, as part of, I think, the colonial experience that we have, we also got a lot of that processed foods like the Vienna sausages, the corned beef, all of those things that are, I think, that we shouldn't be eating that much of, but then we develop a taste for it. And interestingly, if we go outside of the Caribbean, we also see other places like Hawaii is another example of that, where we see a lot of diet-related conditions, and they can also be somewhat linked to that colonial situation, the Native Americans too, with the food that was served in the reservations. So there is that political aspect to that. But also, I do want to say that even though, especially from people from other Latin American countries think, oh, you Puerto Ricans, you are gringos, but at the same time, we forget that even when I went to Cuba, for example, people are eating pizzas, burgers. They have that too, Dominican Republic too. So it's not something unique to Puerto Rico in our experience with the U.S. These companies are transnational, so it's all over the place now.
Yeah, and on that point, you also argue throughout the book that when Puerto Ricans and Cubans and Dominicans move to the United States, they don't necessarily assimilate to American pop food culture, that they might even actually change their habits to improve their healthfulness, no?
Yeah, yes, and that is something that as I was writing the book, that is a point that I really wanted to bring across. Um, my field, as you mentioned, is public health nutrition, so I do a lot of my teaching for future dietitians and and even my colleagues in the field. There's this notion that we moved and we are eating these beautiful healthy diets back home, and suddenly we discover burgers, uh, fried foods like French fries, but that is not the case. Um, and and as I said before, we might be eating those foods already in Puerto Rico, and when we move here, we also encounter other foods. And I use my experience in the book, and also it's not just my experience. It was also interesting to see how it related to other Caribeños that I spoke to. That, for example, growing up in Puerto Rico, I grew up with a lot of processed foods growing up in the city. So I developed that taste. I also had a very limited palate. If my mom is watching, I'm sure she can attest to that. And but that was a function of me being a picky eater, but also not being as exposed maybe to a variety of vegetables. And then when I moved to Boston specifically, to when I did my doctoral, my master's degree there, and I went, for example, to a farmer's market, and I was able to see a variety of vegetables and things like that. I started experimenting. also in New York, something that I learned from the Caribeños, and again, it also resonated with my experience, is that we encounter foods from all over the place in big cities. So people are changing not to eat more so-called American foods, and that can be another conversation about what is American food. But people were talking about eating puris, eating sushi, eating a host of other foods, and then bringing those seasonings home. So it's like this beautiful melting pot of flavors.
Do you use the word, I think you do, the term ahiako for Fernando Ortiz's metaphor for the mixing of all these ingredients in Caribbean culture?
Yeah, I mean, I think he brings this amazing analogy of the ahiako, the soup that cooks slowly, or we can think of the sancocho too, like you have all the flavors cooking slowly, and then the individual ingredient of each sort of disappears and melts together.
Right. Now, you've already told us a little bit about your own background, so I just wanted to maybe ask you to elaborate a little bit. Where were you born and raised, and how and why did you move to the U.S.?
Yes, so I was born in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and I moved to the U.S. when I was 20 years old, like now close to more than half of my life if I think about it. And I first moved here actually just out of curiosity, really. Like I had friends that were studying in the US, and I was curious to see how would that be. So I ended up moving to Miami and finishing my degree at Florida International. Um, yeah, so I always had, like, I think a lot of us when we move, we have the idea or the dream to come back, but then long story short, I haven't been able to do that. And then after I finished my degree at FIU, I moved further up to Boston, now New York, and now moving to New Orleans in the coming month. Yeah.
Do you
So
consider
moving
yourself
down.
do you consider yourself a transnational migrant? Is that a term that we use to describe yourself?
That
Maybe
is that
not.
is a that is a great question, and I'm suddenly reminded of the great conversations that we both have had about that as I was starting to learn about that piece of scholarship that was super important in my work. And I mean, that is, I do try to go to Puerto Rico at least 2 times a year. COVID has, of course, changed things for all of us. And I think being a Puerto Rican and also, again, living in cities where it's so easy to come back and forth, you do live that transnational life in some ways.
And now you have a new chapter in the South, no, in New Orleans.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about your research process? How did you conduct the field work with the three major groups? And also, as you mentioned already, you visited the three islands at some point during the process of writing the book.
Yes. So the way I approached this, and when I moved here and I started developing the work that became the book, I didn't approach it thinking this will be a book. So it was more like I was doing the research that I was trained to do in public health nutrition, and slowly it morphed into a bigger book project. And the way I did it, I did interviews with people here, and I went to a lot of events, and it was sort of like an auto ethnography in a way, because I was myself a Caribeña in New York, and getting to know the city, going to the events of my community, for example, in El Barrio, Lower East Side, also getting to know the other Caribeños like Washington Heights. The Cuban community is fairly small, but I was able to see some of those events, going to restaurants, and I met different Caribeños throughout the journey. It was easier, of course, to connect with fellow Puerto Ricans. It wasn't as easy interestingly, to connect, of course, with outside of Puerto Rican. So I had to rely on networks. For example, the Center for Puerto Rican Studies was amazing in making those connections. The Dominican Studies Institute at CUNY, and going one person to one person. That was sort of the way it was done. And when I did the interviews with people, I didn't want it to be something formal, like, you know, how we researchers can be too formal sometimes. So I basically took people out to lunch and we had conversations about food. And I didn't approach it in a way to say, I'm going to talk about healthy eating with you. I approached it in a way I just want to talk about your diet. And I let them order, I let them pick the food just to also see how they navigate the food environment in the city. And then in terms of the connections that I wanted to make with the Caribbean, again, I went back and forth a lot to Puerto Rico, but then I also had the chance to go to Cuba and then to Dominican Republic. And in those trips, those were fairly like a week long each. And what I try to do at those trips was, of course, eat out, like go to restaurants, supermarkets, just to understand how is the current food environment in those countries, and then in that speak to people. And I also met with experts in both places, both chefs, culinary federation people, and also people on the health side with nutritionists, people in the public health department, to better understand the situation from both the culinary perspective and the nutrition perspective, and then also asking about migration and how that affected the food environments in the country, and then again that back and forth of ideas about food.
How many people did you interview overall?
I'm
24?
forgetting it
I
was,
just
yeah,
have
about 20.
24
20.
interviews. Yes, and then you
Yeah.
also interviewed public health experts in New York City.
Yes. The interviews with dietitians, they were registered dietitians. I decided not to conduct them myself because I am Puerto Rican. I do have an accent, so even if they were by phone, and I had a nutrition student do the interviews for me. So there wouldn't be any, when you ask them questions, that social bias of the answers. So she interviewed 15 dietitians.
Right. And one of the, I think, most striking results of your work is that there was a lot of discrepancy between what the dietitians thought about Caribeño food and what Caribeños themselves thought about it. So, can you explain a little bit that discrepancy and what's going on there?
Yeah, so it's interesting because there were some discrepancies. For example, I thought I wasn't surprised, but it was interesting that when dietitians spoke about the foods of the Hispanic Caribbean, and they were asked about that very generally, they sort of fell on two camps. Some of them said it is unhealthy. I couldn't eat like that every day. Other ones said, oh, it's this idea of it's healthy, but we changed it when they moved here. Again, that linear view of dietary acculturation. And the way they spoke about it, they spoke about culture being this very important thing, about both what I say in that chapter, culture being a cause, but also a solution to the problem. So it was this idea, they're eating like that, is their culture, they're not going to change. And when I present the experiences of Caribeño, I think the most important contrast is that people change. And I think this is like an obvious assertion that people change their diets, not only immigrants, but we all do. And culture it was important, but there were other things happening that led to those changes. And I think that was for me the biggest discrepancy. But also, I do want to point out that as I look into the way people, Caribeños, spoke about the diet, I also saw some areas of overlap. People had this internalized notion that there is something wrong with the way we eat, We need to change it. We are not good eaters. We need to learn how to eat better. So it's this internalized notion that as immigrants, we need to do better. And one way of doing better is by changing our diets.
And by the way, I think that's a general point you make too, that the traditional diets of immigrants like Italians and Mexicans and now Caribeños have been disparaged in the US, right? And considered, as you just said, unhealthy and unsophisticated. How is that connected to race, which is, after all, in the subtitle of your book?
Yeah. So food is, so ingrained to who we are, and at the same time, it can be used to create the other. This is how other people eat, and it's interesting. I mean, I think that one way to explain this might be looking at the Italian American experience, because they have gone through this transition. As you mentioned, when they first arrived, their diet was viewed as insufficient, unsophisticated, not good. They needed to change. But maybe as Puerto Ricans arrived to the city and African Americans started arriving, the Italian Americans sort of became whiter in a way. So it was interesting to see, for example, how even though these diets like spaghetti, for example, were considered once very unsophisticated, unhealthy, there were, I'm forgetting right now the year, but archive shows that Puerto Ricans, I think in the 50s or 40s, were even recommended spaghettis as healthy eating. So it's like this idea as how you view, and then in the U.S., I think it's common to hear that people tend to think about race a lot, and that idea of black and white. So as you become more racialized, you become black in the eyes of people here. Your diets also are used as a way of underscoring that blackness, that racial aspect of the experience.
Okay. And I want to go back to another part of your argument. I forget, I'm looking at my notes, but I can't find them, in which you argue that it's not so much culture, although you do recognize that cultural factors play a part, but it's structural factors, no, that explain, for example, the very high rates of diabetes or obesity among Puerto Ricans. So what do you mean by structural factors?
Yes, so I try to explain it in the book as at a basic level, we can think about it as gender, race, class. I think that might be the easier way to think about it, but also how those get made as again, as we move here, we go through a racialization process that also affects access to education, access to good jobs, access to good healthcare. So it is beyond culture, because again, I'm more than my heritage country. I am a Puerto Rican, but I'm also a woman of color, middle class. So that all intersects in our identity. And I feel that in public health, that overemphasis on where you're from leads to stereotypes. And for example, one thing I love asking my students sometimes is like, okay, I'm Puerto Rican. Do you think I eat rice and beans every day? And they laugh because they realize, like, oh yeah, if you had been my client and you would have said you're Puerto Rican, immediately I think rice, beans, and pork, if they know about the Puerto Rican diet. So it's just trying to look at people and the experience here beyond just where we're from and all the things that interact, because another thing that another place where structure comes in is that it also influences the relationships we have with our traditional diets. In the book, for example, I found really interesting conversations with some Cuban Americans where they were really didn't want to eat the Cuban food, and it's like this interesting way of I'm here now, and I'm gonna eat the food here now, and Cuban food is so unhealthy. I only eat it actually when I go to Miami. So it was the interesting distancing that I felt had to do. I saw it also as as related to that migratory history and the different experience that Cubans have with Cuba. That's another way I feel structure comes in.
Right. And actually, one of your findings was that most Caribbean immigrants in New York City don't go to Caribbean restaurants, right? At least not to their own. They prefer sort of home cooked meals, right? Except as you just mentioned, when Cubans come down to Miami.
Yes, and and that does relate a little bit to the work that I'm doing now with restaurants. Those questions that I ask. But yeah, it was this idea that nobody's gonna make it like abuela or mom, so why pay money for this food? And for example, a Puerto Rican might go to a Cuban restaurant, but not go to a Puerto Rican restaurant. But of course, there are some exceptions because there are certain things that we cannot easily make at home, like pasteles, certain uh, stews, things that take a long time. That is just if you have a restaurant nearby, you can just go and ease that craving there.
Okay. Following on that point, one of the findings in your research was that of the three groups, Cubans in New York City apparently are the ones that know less about the other two, no? Whereas both Puerto Ricans and Dominicans apparently enjoy Cuban food. Can you explain that finding?
Yes. It was just one of these moments in research that you don't want to show your face too much when you're having a conversation, because I was really surprised. As part of the interview, I asked people to talk to, okay, like what do you know about Puerto Rican food or Dominican food? And it really struck me the blank stares, like they knew nothing. And I sort of follow up sometimes like, well, do you know a Puerto Rican? There are a lot of us here. And there was nothing, like not even nothing. And they were like, oh, can you tell me some things? I mean, of course they knew that we have rice and beans in common, but when I asked them, oh, can you name a Puerto Rican or a Dominican dish? There was like, no, I don't know. And when I pushed further with some of them, they also realized like, yeah, maybe there's, again, I don't know a Puerto Rican that would invite me to their home to eat or something like that. But the reason why it struck me is, again, growing up in Puerto Rico, where we do interact with Cubans and Dominicans as part of normal food space, I do know what the foods are, and people do know. So it was this interesting realization of how, when we move here, the cultures that seem so close in the Caribbean are so distant here. And that was interesting, and also I think a little bit sad in some ways.
Yeah. And at the same time, I think it is in this book, or perhaps I've heard you before talk about it. Cuban American food seems to be the most successful in terms of crossing borders, no, of attracting non-Cubans. Why is that?
Mm-hmm.
Especially in New York City.
Yes, I've asked this question to many people, and I think that the easy answer is Cuba is sexier. When you look at the way Cuban restaurants are able to frame the business, you can either go nostalgia, pre-revolution Cuba, Copacabana, beautiful, or some restaurants then go revolutionary. So you have like a revolution theme, and that is exciting and sexy. And you have people, non-Cubans, taking on that concept and using it to create a business. Whereas I feel, even though Puerto Rican has been here for so long, we have not been able, especially in New York, that makes it so interesting, to evolve the cuisine to do much more than rice and pigeon peas and pork. So I think that it's interesting, and I feel some people have written about it too. This, I forget right now where I read it. This idea that the Puerto Rican is your doorman. You're not gonna eat the food of your doorman. Versus also the Cuban. Aside from the sexiness, that was sort of like an easy, funny response here. But going to more serious responses, I feel the work by Lisandro Perez on his recent Cuban book was really amazing in shedding light on that issue, because he does a beautiful job tracing that history of the Cuban community in New York, where they were coming in the 1800s as wealthy merchants to study. So just in that baseline, you have this higher status idea about Cubans versus, for example, the lower rural poor community of most of Puerto Ricans that came here. Not all of them, but most of them.
Okay, and on this difference among the three groups, I also wanted to ask you to comment on the battle for the Mofongo, which you found is claimed both by Dominicans and Puerto Ricans. So what do you say about that?
That was another part in my fieldwork where when I asked a Dominican, tell me some Dominican dishes, and he said mofongo, I think I asked, like, sorry, what? I didn't, of course, argue with the person, but it was one of those times, again, that you, as a researcher, you cannot show so much of your emotions to not steer conversation certain ways. I've been trying to go to the root of that, and even if I have Dominicans, New York Dominicans listening here, I may get some bad comments or something, but I believe, based on my research, that the mofongo is Puerto Rican, and the way it became Dominican is because we do have this big migration of Dominicans to Puerto Rico. A lot of Dominicans work in kitchens in Puerto Rico, and then they move here. So sometimes even people forget these connections that happen before they move here. Another dish that may have a similar trajectory is the pasteles. That Dominicans also have pasteles, and I've seen some people say, again, it's that migration thing. And I have to add, before I have Dominicans jumping at me with the battle, that I asked this question in Dominican Republic, and people there said, like, no, that's Puerto Rican. So I also went to the source. I've asked Dominicans in Puerto Rico, and they have also expressed this migration idea. And I feel even some Dominicans that I've spoken with in Dominican Republic, they were somewhat surprised, like, oh, really? I didn't know they were thinking about mofongo as Dominican.
And of course, going back to the original title of Plantains in Motion, I mean, they do have a lot in common because they're based on plantains. They're cooked differently, as we explain in the book, but they are very similar. They're sort of connected to each other, no?
Yeah.
Okay, let me see. I'm looking at the time, and we were asked to finish in a few minutes. So let me move on to just a couple of broader questions, I think, that your book raises for anyone who is interested in reading it. And one of them has to do with the public health consequences, right? And in general, I think you raised the question of whether traditional food habits of Puerto Ricans, Cubans, and Dominicans are healthy, or whether they lead to, again, high rates of diabetes, heart disease, and other food-related problems. What is your general position on this issue of the sort of practical implications of eating the way we do?
Can you? I'm sorry, I missed the last part of the question.
No, I mean, I just wanted to frame it in terms of what are the implications, the practical implications for health, no, of eating Caribeño food.
Yeah. So let me see how, because I think also in answering that question, we also have to think about what is traditional food. And I think that varies a lot depending on who you ask. And I think the part of the problem maybe or situation when we ask people about their traditional diets, and for example, yes, they're parts of our diets, like the fried foods that we love so much, the big mountains of rice that as a public health nutritionist, I would like people to eat, of course, less of. But there's also, I also invite people to rethink what is tradition. Because I think we have this set notions of traditional, authentic food is this, when in reality, tradition is not static. I think that the beauty of me going back to the Caribbean, to Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Dominican Republic, and having meals at different restaurants was I was able to being able to see a lot of more vegetables, more going back to the farm. Um, so we are able to rediscover those other areas of our so-called traditional foods, and then bring it back to how people understand the food. That can be a way of promoting healthier eating. But then aside from that, I mean, it is a good thing to think about, but also again, think about beyond the diet, beyond that individual behavior that we want people to change, how we can create better conditions for people to eat better, to be more physically active. And then that will relate to better health outcomes. And this is when we have to get to those conversations about the structural factors again, education, having access, physical and economic access to good foods, to the beautiful farmers markets I was exposed with when I came here, and the money to buy the vegetables, to experiment with different foods.
Great. So my final question, you actually raised in the beginning of your book your hope that you can help to change scholarly conversations about immigrant food experiences and health outcomes. So how exactly do you think that can happen? How can change come along?
Yeah, I think again the change I would love to see is just and this is more speaking to my discipline, of trying to be more nuanced when we speak about culture and food. Like again, what do we mean by that? How foods get to just again trying to think more holistic, again, race, class, gender, and how that influence the what we eat, and also the scholarship as well, thinking again beyond that individual focus, trying to bring in more disciplines to into how we understand eating habits, and health outcomes.
Great. Okay, so I still have a couple of more questions, but I'll hold to those because we do have, well, one question and one comment in the ask a question button. The comment is from Adela Brito, and she says that maybe it's the mojitos that make Cuban restaurants sexier. Although I would
Yeah,
say, of course, you can have mojitos in Dominican and Puerto Rican restaurants as well, right? And there's piña
yeah.
colada, there's other drinks. Anyway, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
That is a good point, but as you say, we the same way that people love the mojito, they could also love the piña colada, and it's not as popular as the mojito. So yeah, I mean, and I will say that when I say that is sexier, and I talk about that higher status or being more popular, I'm not, of course, taking away anything from Cuban cuisine. It is delicious, and there's this whole cocktail area of the cuisine and the food that, of course, makes it enjoyable. But again, we're all rum producers, so there is also the same cocktails or similar approaching that other restaurants could do for Dominican or Puerto Rican cuisines.
Yeah. One of the things that I remember clearly hearing you compare the three cuisines in New York City was that many of the sort of posh Cuban restaurants in New York are not really Cuban. I mean, and you mentioned it also tonight. They're owned by non-Cubans who are taking advantage of that Cuban thing, right? That apparently is very appealing to non-Cubans.
Yeah, and you see the same thing now with Mexican cuisine and Peruvian cuisine. These are cuisines that have gained a lot of popularity. So, of course, if you're a restaurateur and you see people gravitating to these cuisines and you get to know them, it makes sense for a business perspective.
Okay, so here's a real question from our friends at Books and Books. They want to know what was the best part of writing this book?
Wow. um, I think that the best part and also the most difficult part was taking that deep dive into the history. Growing up in Puerto Rico, we don't get to learn that much about our history. the way we learn it is through our own looking books and reading. So it's not that I came in not knowing. That was sort of what drove me to this. But then really taking that very deep dive was super interesting. I had the chance, something again in public health, we don't do this. We don't visit archives or look into archival material, and it was amazing just to sit down. For example, I went to the archives at FIU and just sat with boxes and look at photos, and it was beautiful just to see these amazing historic documents. But at the same time, it was also sad because you also get to know about the awful ways that my community was spoken about. And so that was, again, so it was interesting and good for me, but also at times it was emotional to learn, for example, about the Puerto Rican problem, how they viewed the young kids that were coming into school as retarded, using those words even in the writing. Yeah, so it was difficult in that sense, but of course really amazing and interesting.
Okay, so we have another question from Maria Padilla. She asks, so bottom line, can you eat the sancocho or not?
Of course. Yes, and sancocho technically it's healthy. Yeah, it's
Maybe
delicious
not
and
in,
healthy. Yes.
maybe not in the huge quantities that some people like to eat it in Christmas, for example. I guess. So let me invite
Yeah,
again.
yeah.
Yeah, just to invite
Oh
the
no, no, I
audience.
mean, yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh no, yes, I was just gonna say that definitely it's better than other things, but it's good.
Okay, we have a few more minutes, so if you are still out there listening to our conversation, please do submit your questions. I want to take the advantage of the pause now and ask Dr. Fuster to please tell us about her experience learning to prepare pasteles, because I think that's one of the most interesting anecdotes that she tells in the book.
Yeah, so I've never made pasteles before. And I say this because when I moved here, interestingly, to New York, I heard of the pasteladas where families get together, they make pasteles for the season. So growing up, maybe this is a function of growing up in an urban setting, or honestly, I don't know why exactly, but I never really learned how to. In my family, and I think it's a common experience in Puerto Rico, you get a woman usually that makes them, and you buy them for Christmas. So I was one of the people that I interviewed. She made pasteles as part of her home business, and I casually mentioned, "Oh, I've never made pasteles," and she was, "What? You need to learn how to do it." So she was amazing, and she invited me over to her apartment in the Lower East Side, and I recount the story of coming in and the smell of the root crops, and then failing pretty much at a lot of the steps of the pasteles. It is a tough process. I haven't, of course, even tried to make them at home. I'm still in my small New York City apartment. I don't have the space. So yeah, it was super interesting. And I remember her mom was there and a family friend. And when she mentioned, oh, she's Puerto Rican and she's never made pasteles, that was like they were surprised. And again, it's this idea like, but back home, that's not uncommon that you never make pasteles because you buy them, especially if you, again, I was born and raised in San Juan, so there's also that urban aspect of my experience.
Yeah, in some ways that scene reminds me of the novel by Laura Esquivel, Como Agua para Chocolate, no? Where all the women sit in the kitchen and they have this bonding experience, no, as a result of their cooking. And
Yeah.
thinking about cooking, just a couple more questions, and then we can probably close our conversation. I remember reading an early version of of your manuscript, and I think you had a longer section about cookbooks, no? Especially for Cuba and Puerto Rico. So, can you tell us a little bit about that? What is the importance of these? I think you wrote about Nitza Villapol and Valdeyuri, Carmen Valdeyuri, the two most famous
Yeah.
Cuban and Puerto Rican cookbook writers.
Yeah, so that exploration was actually my first dive into this project. So I came from El Salvador speaking to people about hunger, food insecurity, to being in a library with cookbooks. That was amazing. Um, and I think the reason why I work with the work of these two women is that they were writing at the same time in the 1950s, one in Cuba, one in Puerto Rico, and they are both, sometimes they're called the Julia Child of Cuban Puerto Rican cuisine respectively, because these are books that people have in their kitchens. I have Cocina Criolla in my kitchen. I also, because of my work, have Cocina en Minuto. um, so it was super interesting to trace the histories of these socialite women. They were both coming from not the usual backgrounds of their fellow Cuban and Puerto Ricans. And then the way I did write a piece about this where I did that very deep dive. Um, of course, when the revolution comes and Nitza Villapol stays in Cuba, even though people don't know, some people think they left, to see the book from the 1950s and the 1989 version, it's like cielo la tierra, like two completely different things. And that shock was really amazing to see in that cookbook trajectory, whereas Cocina Criolla hardly changes. Maybe I think one of the changes that I remember is that she talks about a formal dinner, and then at the end of the formal dinner, the women have cigarettes, the men have cigars. And then in the version of now, of course, that part is taken out because of public health concerns. But it wasn't the same as that impactful change in Nitza Villapol's work.
And why isn't there an equivalent in the Dominican Republic?
That I've been trying to find the answer to that question, especially when you realize that if you go to Dominican Republic, to Santo Domingo, they have the first of so many in the Americas. They got the printing press before Cuba and Puerto Rico, so you would expect that a cookbook would follow. I don't have a clear answer about that, but it might have to do. Honestly, I might start speculating, but it is a good question. That they don't have that same trajectory, because in Cuba and Puerto Rico, something I did focus on the iconic books. The very first cookbooks come from the 1850s something. They were fairly close by at the same time that we were having, for example, the start of the revolutionary anti-Spain revolts in both islands. Um, so the cookbooks in Cuba and Puerto Rico arguably come as this statement of we are a nation different from Spain, whereas you didn't see that so much in Dominican Republic. I feel maybe the first cookbook was around the 1950s, but don't quote me on that because I may have my notes wrong on that one.
Okay, I think unless there's another urgent question from the audience, we're about to close our conversation. I want to thank Dr. Melissa Fuster for sharing her work with us and everyone for being there. I want to remind you again that you can purchase the book. The information is down there on your screen, or you can go to Books and Books and purchase your own copy. So thank you, Dr. Fuster, again. Thank you all for being here. And this concludes our presentation tonight.
Thank you, everybody.